I'll get to see this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, God.
All right. Yeah, ready when you guys are.
So, Professor Sangeeta Ray, describe yourself and a little bit of your family, education, and work background.
Oh, okay, so I grew up in India, and I was born in India, and I grew up in India, and I lived all over India because my father worked for, the sort of the Reserve Bank, which is like the Federal Reserve Bank here, and so we traveled quite a bit. But I'm originally from the east of India, which is from the state of West Bengal. But I grew up in Mumbai, what they call Mumbai now, what we used to call Bombay, and then we traveled all around India, depending on where my father was posted, and then we ended up in Mauritius, in the island of Mauritius, and my father died quite young, and like most South Asians or most Asians, there's a lot of pressure to be, a lawyer or an engineer. And in India, when I was growing up, if you were very, very smart, and the idea was, and you got tracked early on, so I was tracked into the science, even though I was very good in lit. But my father always wanted me to be like somebody who did literature. So it was after he died, I had actually got into sort of the medical school in India. When my father died, then we came back to Calcutta, and I needed a year's break just to my mother and I, and my brother. There were just three of us to kind of settle in. And so then I was like, what am I going to do for 1 year while I wait? So I joined the local college in Calcutta and became an English major, and then never looked back. And then I was like, I'm not going to go to med school. I just love this. And then I studied there, and then I came here in about 1985, and I got a master's in, I don't know if you've heard of this place called Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, which was like a real culture shock for me because it was like a small town, and I'd never been in small towns in my life. And I was like, this is America? Like, it is like one street, 4 buildings. And then I went to the University of Washington in Seattle for my PhD. So I came to Ohio for 2 years, and then I went to Washington, and then I got this job. And after I finished my PhD, and I've been here since 1991, teaching. So when I came here to do my master's and PhD, I thought I was going to be studying Victorian literature, so 19th century British, because that made the most sense, because India was a British colony for so long, which is why we grew up speaking English. So English is like almost my mother tongue. And I came here, and I was like, okay, that's what I'm going to do. I like Dickens, Thomas Hardy, and in the process of I came with a very good background in English lit, unlike a lot of people who get their education here. So I knew all of British lit pretty much, and so when I came here, I was exposed to some American lit, because of course in India in those days people thought Americans, what is American lit? Nothing called American lit, right? They're just such a new country, and so then I was introduced to what you would call in the 90s, in the late 80s, early 90s, something called high theory. And through that high theory, I got to learn something called post-colonial theory, and I was really fascinated by that. Sort of the whole idea of the British Empire, its influence on the colonies, why the history of oppression, national independence, Indian literature, and so I ended up writing a dissertation that was comparative. So it was partly on Bengali literature, partly on Victorian literature, and partly on Indian literature in English. And the field that I'm in was then just like starting out. It was a big field. It was like it was the right moment at the right time at the right moment. So I got this job. I was married, and my partner was also an academic, and so he was teaching in Florida, also an English major, also an English PhD. And then so we were looking for places on the same coast so we could just commute. So he was at the University of Florida. I was here, and so that was I teach. So I teach literatures from South Asia, the Africa, and the Caribbean. So that's kind of my background, and I've written a few books, a lot of articles, edited an anthology. I just recently edited a 3-volume, came out in 2017, 3-volume encyclopedia of post-colonial studies. My last book I just finished writing is coming out hopefully at the end of this year or maybe early next year. So that's kind of my background. So I grew up quite sort of, I come from quite a privileged background. So coming here and becoming like being perceived as an Indian woman, or I mean, I remember thinking about, oh, I never thought of myself as an Indian woman when I was in India. I was like a Bengali woman. I was an Indian, and when I came here, I was like South Asian. And then I was also, as things progressed, I also became a woman of color, and then I'm somehow now Asian American, though I'm not. I mean, I guess I would be an Asian American, but I still think of myself as a South Asian who teaches the post-colonial life. Does that make sense, or do you want me to talk a little bit about how I got into Asian American studies, or is that something you want to wait to ask?
Yeah, no, just wait
Yeah.
to ask that. Okay.
What is it?
Yeah, ready
Okay.
when you are.
Describe your relationship to the founding and growth of the Asian American Studies program at the University of Maryland. Be as specific with dates, names, and other details as possible.
I'm not sure if I would remember the dates quite well. So when I came here, we didn't have somebody in the English department that taught Asian American Lit. But we had a person who was, either she was a lecturer or some administrator, Bonnie something, I cannot remember her name now. And in my third, fourth year as a professor here, so we got together and decided she wanted to do this course. There had never been a course on Asian American studies, you know. When I was teaching, you know, like I would throw in writers that you would have considered, like Bharati Mukherjee. And she was always like, I'm not an Indian writer, I'm an American writer, right? So I taught Maxine Hong Kingston, you know, at some point. So I taught myself Asian American literature because I was like, that's interesting, through the South Asian. And at that point when I was teaching, South Asian writers were not considered to be like South Asian American, because Asian American still is profoundly dominated by Southeast Asians and East Asians, right? So Filipino American, Vietnamese American, Korean American, Chinese American, you know, the most dominant. So South Asians were always seen like the post-60s immigration that happened. As you all know, if you're studying Asian American studies, there's all these sort of laws that prevented people from coming. So the 1960s, post-60s sort of migration of South Asians were just South Asians, you know. So they were all engineers and doctors, so they were not writing literature. So there were very few there were still writers writing in English, but they were always considered Asian. But then every now and then I would throw in a book. And so when Bonnie decided to do this Asian American Studies class, I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. And then Bonnie left. She was going to do the course, and then she left somewhere. And suddenly somebody had to teach this class. And there was nobody to teach this class but me. There was this guy whose name I cannot remember, who was he was a PhD student. What was his name? I'm drawing an absolute blank on this. But he was very instrumental, and I forget which department he was. It may have been in government, School of Public Policy, or I forget his name. Will something, his name was. Phil will know the name. And so Will and Bonnie were the ones who were going to teach this class. And so then when it didn't happen and they needed a professor, I mean, I kind of stepped in and I taught myself basically the syllabus, you know. So that's how I learned about Ronald Takaki and these books called Strangers from a Different Shore. And this was probably, I want to say before I got tenure. So it must have been 1994, 1993, 1994 that I taught this class. And it was a big learning curve for me. Like I had to learn while I was teaching. In that class there was this wonderful student, Angela, and I'm going to draw a bad blank on her last name. She was a Filipino American, and she was one of the brightest students. She was like a freshman, very gung-ho for Asian American sisters. And there were two sisters, one started a little later, and they were very, very instrumental in getting Asian American studies off the ground. She was in my class, and she ended up doing what's called an independent studies major with me in the end. And she taught me a lot. So we taught that class, And then at that same time, around that same time, we hired Professor Candice Chu, who was a junior professor. She came here, and we hired her as an Asian Americanist. So there was a lot of a concatenation of circumstances. There was the course that was taught. There was a tremendous surge of interest from students who lobbied really hard. They had a sit-in at the chancellor's office. They rallied the forces. They did. I would say that the Asian American Studies certificate program exists here not because of the professors, but because there wasn't a mass of professors, but it was the students. So they drove. They were I think, So in a way, the founding of Asian American Studies here is a kind of reminder of how ethnic studies began in the 60s, post-Civil War, but sort of 60s, not Civil War, but 60s sort of, the sort of anti-Vietnam, that what was happening with ethnic studies in Berkeley, in California. We saw a similar kind of, in a small scale here, with these wonderful students. So that was one part of it. And then the university decided to have a committee to try to see what we could do. And I could go on talking about that, or I could take another question, but I could go on telling you some more about how this was formed.
Yeah, I think.
Should I go on?
I think that flows into the next question, so maybe you could just ask the next one, and then.
Can I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Paint a picture for us of what it was like to be on campus at the time. What are some of the vivid memories you have that can help us to understand life in College Park around the year 2000?
Well, so when all of this was going on, the then dean of the two colleges, I think it was the behavioral, whatever, BSOS and ARHO, and then there was the provost. They were all sort of, we have to do something to address this. But, the Asian American Studies has been primarily either from BSOS, Behavioral and Social Sciences, and the humanities oriented, right? It's never involved scientists. But at that point in time, the University of Maryland had a big sort of China program that had just started going, sort of coming together. This was earlier, before 2000, right? Because I still hadn't gotten tenure. I got tenure in 96 and 97. And tenure just means, you're here for 6 years and then you get promoted. And for some reason, the administration, whatever the reasons they ever want to do, they chose the guy who was the director of the Chinese studies program to be the chair of the committee. And there were a couple of scientists. There was a physicist, Bob, whose name I can't remember, and there was an entomologist, Michael Ma. Now him I remember. And they wanted an involvement with this group, but they did not have a clue as to what Asian American Studies was. It was one of the really troubling moments, because it was like, if we are going to let you have an Asian American Studies program, we want an input. But we don't really understand what it is that you do, but we want an input. And their rhetoric was kind of racist, because they would say things like, we don't want to reproduce what African American Studies does. We don't want something called victim studies, is what they would say. Like, we don't want minority studies. And I was like, do you know anything about Asian American Studies? So they really wanted to have a component for the certificate that you take, to like have courses in science. And so their ideas of, for example, Bob, somebody, was like, when I go teach in the Philippines, they have very bad labs, and my students can go and we use Bunsen burners. And I was like, that's not Asian American Studies. I mean, how would you make this about Asian American Studies? And we gave them an idea, for example, to think about discrepancy, think about colonial occupation of the Philippines by the Spanish, then the US. And so, can you bring that up? But they had no idea of that discourse. So anyway, so that was all going on, and we had meetings, and there was a lot of, it was not easy, let's put it that way. We had some key players. One was Professor Sung Kyung Kim, who went off just about a couple of years ago to Indiana, who was a director of the Asian American Studies certificate for a while. So we had her, and we had me, and we had Candice in the background, and we just like, what are you talking about, right? So we held a kind of a little mini conference We did 2 of them, I think one, and we had Gary Okihiro, who was at Cornell at the time, and we had and we had another wonderful person called Gina Marchetti, who was then in the media studies program, then became part of Complet, and she worked on Asian American studies slash Asia. She had written a fantastic book called The Yellow Peril, looking at cinema. You know what the Yellow Peril is. We've done so the Asians coming in, was the thing. So we had some wonderful people, but we were not being listened to. So we had this sort of meeting, we had this sort of forum, and Gary Okihiro came, and Gina Marchetti gave a talk, and we had Lisa Lowe and David Palambulu. There was another conference. We had a series of events to get people to come in to sort of educate the audience about what Asian American Studies was. So I'll give you one example of how hard we worked to get this off the ground. We were, so Gary Hook, I think it was Gina Marchetti, was talking about the Yellow Peril, and one of the things she talked about was the kind of emasculinization of Asian men that happens in media. So the whole idea is how do you represent Asian American masculinity? And so she had this wonderful sort of clip, which was like, when you see movies like Rambo, Sylvester Stallone, the sort of the muscled white man, right? So you have these kind of, or you have like African American black men, how the stereotypes are produced in film, but you never see Asian American men, and when you do, so for example, she said you'll have a movie with Sylvester Stallone, like Rambo falling off the airplane, white man saves the world, I don't know, I think it's called, the movie is Rambo, where he's on a plane, going to do a rescue mission in Vietnam, but he has to get rid of all the explosives because he cannot land because the plane is going to crash. But the one white man with the one knife, he can rescue, just stupid. And a lot of blood, a lot of fighting. And she was comparing that to the Bruce Lee films. And she was like, whenever Asian American movies are shown, it's very skill based, right? It's like, kung fu or karate, but it's about, but it's never focused on the kind of strength, even though it requires so much strength. So she was talking about those kinds of representations of masculinity as how the kind of Bruce Lee, you don't think of him as like Jackie Chan is a newer version, but he's, he hits everybody, and alongside he uses his fists and everything. But Bruce Lee, you don't kind of see that. And it was a wonderfully nuanced argument about looking at sort of representations of Asian masculinity. And after it was over, Michael Ma raises his hand and goes, I don't understand. China is the most populated country in the world. What do you mean by emasculation of Asian American masculinity? So we were like, we're not talking about that at all. We're talking about representation. So for him, they couldn't even understand what we were talking about. But anyway, we couldn't get the certificate off the ground till we involved them. So we actually ended up creating a program and telling them come up with some course descriptions. And they did, and they were never taught. They disappeared, because you can't really do it, right? And so even though the original document had certain courses that, I don't know what you would do with insects in Asian American, but whatever, but it never got up. We had it, the proposal was approved, so what you're seeing now is a version of that, and I don't think anybody has, in the archives, there might be the original document. So we were like, okay, we're not going to fight it, let's just do it, and it was done. So once it was done, it was great. So
speaking directly into the camera, addressing future generations of Asian American Studies students, summarize in just a minute your dreams for them, and any lessons learned since your days affiliated with AAST.
So and I just repeat what I just said, is that I think the future of Asian American Studies on this campus depends on Asian American Studies students. I think students who have a voice in the university, I think students can get the president and the provost to listen to them. And I feel like, especially nowadays, since the humanities are under attack and everything has become about skill sets, like whether you're a computer science major or an engineering major, the art of thinking creatively and philosophically is under peril. And I think that trying to keep Asian American Studies alive would create a space where students from different backgrounds could come together to think about themselves not just as Asian Americans, which itself is a very complex phenomenon, but to think about what you want to offer the world beyond just the kinds of work that you might choose in your career. Like, are you a political person? Do you have a certain kind of politics? How would you like to change the world? Maybe not one sound bite at a time, but maybe something bigger. And I think we are in somewhat of a danger in maybe losing all that we have built so far. And in order to keep going, for it to become functional, I would urge the students to really, really push the university to hire somebody central in the field of Asian American Studies, housed in arts and humanities. Somebody trained in Asian American Studies who can be a good leader for the certificate program. Thanks.